Take 3. There we go. How's your week been, Luca?
Lovely, thank you very much. I thought I'd keep this theme going, and hopefully the audio is a little bit better tonight.
Yeah, we've stepped it up today. We've got 2 microphones, so hopefully, Prof. Bouquet, this will live up to your audio expectations today. So we're trying hard. We're listening and changing. And today we've got an interesting webinar, I guess, podcast, if you like, on WaveOne Gold we've chosen, actually, haven't we?
Yeah, it's something that we've taught a lot over the last couple of years. I think we've been teaching it for the last 6-7 years, doing our courses. And how many dentists have we sort of?
Oh, I don't know. We're probably sort of 600 plus dentists. We've had the pleasure to train on WaveOne Gold, and we really enjoy using this system because it's quite simple, and we'll look at it and try to understand, how it works, what it does. But we feel particularly for inexperienced users, it helps to kind of transition into the world of night eye that little bit easier. I've certainly noticed that.
Yeah, it seems like a good file that people pick up and understand and can use relatively quickly. I think it's a good first step into the night eye world for sure.
Yeah, absolutely. And we always like to kick off with a clinical case because it just ties some relevance into, we're using this instrument. Ultimately, it's doing endodontic treatment, and this is one of your cases, isn't it? So why don't you walk through, kind of top to bottom, what we've got here and what your feelings are with it? Yeah,
I think it's a sort of a good representation of what you can recreate. What we show you is what we truly believe you can recreate. Because we teach something that can be applied in everyday practice, not just specialist level. So I think this was a tooth that was presented to me with a chronic apical periodontitis diagnosis. That periapical radiolucency of the distal root. Luckily, in this case, the canals are visible on the radiograph, so hopefully we can find them relatively easily. For once. Nice pulp chamber, so we remove the restoration, and in treatment terms, I normally scout with the size 10 file.
Sure. Yeah.
I take a size 10 file, a C-pilot. That's what I normally prefer to use, and find where the canals are and how far that file will advance unimpeded. At that point, I create what you really described really well, which is just orifice enlargement. So just opening up the coronal aspect. So coronal flare may have been interpreted as. And I normally use a WaveOne Gold primary file, so the red. Mm-hmm. I am a simple person, simple mind, so I just want to use something that I'll use throughout treatment. So I normally use the WaveOne Gold primary, the red one, to open up the orifices. And by that, I mean just working the top couple of millimeters of the canal. There's very little engagement on the file, but it's just the tip of the file ever slightly brushing those. So
is that using almost in essence, like, for example, you've got SX, you've got XAs, which are kind of proprietary openers. You're using your WaveOne Gold primary just so you're using less files, basically?
Yeah, 100%. That is effectively that. It means I have less files to think about, less things to open. But also the advantage of the WaveOne Gold is that, we'll touch on it later, is that it's heat treated, so I can pre-bend it. So if I'm starting a treatment and it's a difficult access, I can pre-bend this file and place the tip of the file straight into the canal orifice and just enlarge it like that. So I think that's a benefit of it. But mainly so that we have less files involved in the whole equation. So simplicity.
Absolutely. Yeah. And so this is once you've got in, you sort of opened up the canals themselves, you're kind of working your way down. Mm-hmm. What are you using typically for your glide path file? I know we'll go into a few of the options that are out there, but
I think what I really like, and you and I were sort of part of the early testing of this file, and we, from the word go, we really liked it, and we still think it's one of the best glider files. So for this case, I used 3 files. Yeah. So the size 10 C-pilot to scout, the WaveOne Gold primary red to open up the canals. And in this case, for my glide path file, I use the WaveOne Gold glider. Yep. So once I've done my orifice opening, I take my 10 further, and in this case, it reached the apex. And then I take my WaveOne Gold glider, my glider file, to my 0 reading. Yep. And then my WaveOne Gold primary, my finishing file, to 0.5 millimeter short of that.
Yeah, it's a simple technique, isn't it? 10 glider shaper, done. And that's pretty much what the file system gives you. And it's kind of split into it's kind of two bits really. So you've got the glide path file, the WaveOne Gold glider, which is the file that you can see on the top of the graphic there with the white band, and then you've got the shapers as well. And they just do exactly what they say. One does the glide path, one does the shaping.
Yeah.
And they work very much hand in hand, the glide path file making the shaping that little bit more straightforward. Mm-hmm. It's an interesting file system, and often we're involved a lot with teaching newly qualified dentists, so foundation dentists here in the UK, so within their first year, if you like. And most dentists at undergraduate level are exposed to continuous rotation, aren't they? Not necessarily. They might look at reciprocation, but a lot of the time it's a new movement to them. And the reciprocation motion is exactly this, as you can see the graphic moving here. It's a biphasic rotation. So it's going 150 degrees one way, 30 degrees back the other. So if you're good at maths, which you're not, 3 clicks, and it's made a full rotation. It spins broadly at 350 RPM. Mm-hmm. And I mean, this is a kind of a movement that you'll be familiar with as well. And it's kind of sort of, it's almost from balanced force, isn't it?
It is, but it was something that was designed in the 80s by James Rowan, balanced force, the clicking sound that you hear. But it was designed behind bigger files, hand files. So what's the benefit of this reciprocating motion at the end of the day? Why do I need it? Why can't I just spin a 360?
Well, it supposedly it will keep you more centered. So that's what balanced force was all about, wasn't it? As you transitioned, as you say, through those bigger files, it keeps you better centered in the root canal. And the other benefit, really, if you think about it, so when a file is engaging, it starts to go under torsion. It's being sort of stretched one way and the other, and it pings it back before it hits its torsional failure limit. So the concept behind it is it keeps you better centered and reduces the risk of you breaking a file within the canal system. So safety, really, and following the geometry, as we could see from your initial case. You followed the geometry really nicely of the root canal there.
Yeah.
The glide path file, both of us think is a lovely file, don't we? Size 15 at the tip, and as we look at the graphic here, it's got that sort of expanding kind of upside down Christmas tree to it.
And I think that's the key. It's small at the tip and it's delicate at the tip, and it's not working at the tip. That's sort of the common misconception, and it's expanding that glide path. And I think we can see it maybe in a comparison to hand files. This is why we really advocate mechanized glide paths, because it actually reduces the chance of error and it speeds up the process, and it really opens up that coronal aspect of the tooth that you really want to remove the interferences from. So compared to 1015, I think we've got a quite good graphic to show you how much more work this file is doing coronally, and allowing you to progress further down. So I think that's why it's really key. Yeah,
absolutely. Would you advocate just going with a mechanised glide path? What are your thoughts? Because you see a lot of this now about going straight in with a glide path file and no hand file.
Yeah, I wouldn't.
I personally don't like it either.
Maybe we're not skilled enough.
Or maybe we've broken too many files to understand the danger involved with it. So we always, with our teaching, we, as you said, your case, put the size 10 file. It's not going to break the bank to have a size 10K file. It's not going to slow you up. It's only going to reduce the risk of making mistakes. But the glide path file, when we compare it to, hand files alone, so here we've got on the graphic a 10 and a 15. What we're looking at, particularly if we look at the D12 and D16s here, okay, so when we're bringing our shaping file in, the shaping file is going to really start working in the canal, isn't it? And what the glide path file does is it creates what we call an expanded glide path. So it cuts a bigger shape than a size 15 in the D8 to 16 area compared to a 15 and 20 hand file. And that's really key.
Why do we always, you and I probably, unfortunately, know this through experience, but why did we get all the issues between the 10 and the 15? That was usually the step where we think, this 15 file doesn't work, or it's weak.
Yeah, well, it's just basic mathematics, isn't it? You are going from a size 10 to a size 15. So you're going from a 0.1 to a 0.15 millimeter file. It's a 50% increase in size, and there's no other kind of jump in file sizes sequentially in the isoforms
Yeah.
that are such a big jump, and that's often why we get that real difficult transition between a 10 and a 15 hand file.
Yeah.
And being nickel titanium, which the Gold Glider is, it does help with that transition as long as that 10 has gone down and is reproducible at length. And then you've got the WaveOne Gold family, and it always annoys me. I sort of look at the bottom of the screen and there's sort of the red, green and white, and it just reminds me of the Italian flag, Lucas.
Just quality, just
quality.
like the Italians, really. But they are Swiss made, so to be fair enough.
But why don't you run through the files and what makes them kind of interesting in terms, because we've got another slide looking at the kind of tapers and stuff as well.
I think the basic message here is that you have different files to suit different scenarios, and again it's familiar. So you have the yellow, red, green and white, and they match your ISO standard files. So the yellow is the 20, the red 25, green 35, and the white 45. I think white I haven't used personally, because when I get to that size of canals, I'll be using hand files really.
Yeah, I agree.
Apically. The primary, would you say, does 85% of your cases?
Yeah, I think the majority, very, very much the majority of the cases that we walk through the door, and we're very fortunate to work with a lot of very good referring dentists, and they basically take the view that if they're going to struggle to use a primary, they're going to send the case on, and I think that's quite a good kind of philosophy, really.
I think the small is very helpful for those canals that are long. They're slightly more calcified, so your 10 goes down, your glider goes down, but you felt that it was working. You take your primary down, and you're getting to 2/3 of the canal, and it's asking a lot of it. So the small is something that I would definitely use as a transitional file, and the small is really fantastic to go through those double curvatures or small long canals. So I think the small and the primary will really serve you well. The primary is your finishing file, and I think what's interesting is really this decreasing tapers, the variable tapers that throughout the file. And I think you love this file, this slide to geek out on. So
I mean, who doesn't? I love looking at tapers on files, and actually, it's really critical because we talked in podcast 1 about how important pericervical dentine is, and whilst this will cut a bigger shape than say True Anatomy that we use very routinely on our cases these days, I think if you're a dentist that's perhaps not doing as much endo as we are, you want a file that is easy to cut an apical shape. So you can see here the 7% tapers at the tip. It creates a decent shape that you can irrigate a little bit more easily. You perhaps can fit a GP cone more easily. But as we see, the taper decreases. So if it was 7% the whole way up, it's going to be huge and cut a ton of dentine. But it's a regressive taper, so it decreases. So you prep a bit apically, you conserve a bit more than you would normally, coronally. The other thing about it is the way you use it. So it's an up and down, isn't it? Whereas with what can we use as an example?
ProTaper Next, or ProTaper Gold, or the ProTaper Universals. You have this brushing movement on the way out. These are sort of self-advancing, if you want. So they will be, because remember that movement, that balanced force movement, it will engage and grip the dentine and then break it the other way. So you're almost letting it feed and then come out, let it feed and come out. So you are sacrificing less dentin coronally because you're not brushing as much. The tip is working more, whereas ProTaper Next and Universals and Golds, we have to get into the mindset that you use these files differently. You're brushing on the way out, so it's working on the way out.
I think that's often forgotten in this conversation around dentine preservation. The use and the action and the mode of the file. Everyone gets really hung up on the D16 diameter is 1.13 millimeters, like we've got here with the primary, versus the ultimate, which has got a 1.0 millimeter. You use them in entirely different ways. So you're not going to cut that shape. It's going to be bigger when you're brushing, for sure. And it's well made, this file. It's got this cross section at the bottom. It's got this sort of what they call steep transition angle. So it's got that kind of point to it, which enables it to follow the glide path that's formed. The parallelogram, the offset parallelogram. And we always say with this, don't get too hung up about the cross section. Look at the space around it. So the white space is where you get the dentine that can be pulled out the canal. It's only contacting on either 1 or 2 at different points of the file, so it doesn't drag you in. So as a user, you're less likely to block it. you're less likely to break it. So you can get into all the technical detail, but actually just if you look at the benefit, there's a lot of benefit here.
Yeah.
And why don't you run through the kind of the heat treatment side of things with it?
Yeah, I mean, the heat treatment is sort of any file that you see nowadays that's coloured is probably a heat-treated file. And the newer thermal treatment means that these have a sort of shape memory, which means that you can pre-bend them and they will stay bent to a certain degree before they just re-establish their normal straight shape. That means that in terms of, again, you can go into the technicalities as you mentioned, John, but if you look at the actual practicalities in the mouth, it means that I can pre-bend a file to get to a mesiobuccal of a upper molar or someone that can't open very wide. It means that because it's softer, it will follow the anatomy morphology a little bit more kindly, so it has less of restoring forces as previous M-wire. It's also, it goes without saying, it's more fracture resistant in terms of cyclic and torsional fatigue. So those are the technical aspects that really, really nitty gritty. But in terms of practicality, you have something that's stronger, more flexible, and will help you get into the tooth without having to bend the handpiece or having the patient open wider.
Yeah,
to me, that's what matters to me.
And I think that just sums up almost every point there on the kind of benefit slide, if you like. And just to wind up, I think this can kind of highlight a few of those bits, actually, this clinical case, which was a case I did, a recently fitted porcelain bonded crown, flared up, irreversible pulpitis tooth. So patient had a lot of hot cold pain, throbbing toothache, and we chose here actually to do this endo through the crown, trying to keep it reasonably small, but the picture there shows you can pre-curve these. So traditionally, you may well have been opening things up and drilling dentine away in order to create the space. You know, like protaper necks, for example, you'd have to cut quite a bit of tissue away to use here. And you can maintain the shape in that pericervical area. It's not as conservative as true anatomy. It's not as conservative as things like DC taper or O4 taper systems. But I think in terms of a good file system to do a lot of kind of what I call, nuts and bolts endo that general practitioners would do, I think it's a brilliant system.
Yes.
Simple and easy. So hopefully that's been useful to you guys, and thanks, Luca, for bringing your first case as well.
Thank you. Thanks, John. Thanks for having me on the on our podcast.
On my podcast. I don't think so. But we'll see you guys next week.
Thank you.
Cheers.